Hey guys, welcome back. We are continuing on with Chapter 3 of our book, The Sickness is a System, When Capitalism Fails to Protect Us from COVID, from Pandemics or Itself, by Richard Wolff, who I personally think is one of the best economists out there. I really love his work and keeping up with him for the past couple of years. I'm really excited to hopefully get done with Chapter 3 either with this video or the next one and move on to Chapter 4, which I believe should be the end of it, so again, depends on how long I can make these videos and when I'm able to film. But other than that, let's get back into it. So mass unemployment is a failure of capitalism. The difficulties caused to workers by record unemployment during the pandemic are a product of capitalism. Most of the time, employers decide to hire or fire workers depending on which choice maximizes employers' profits. Profit, not the full employment of workers, nor of means of production, is the bottom line of capitalism, and thus of capitalists. That is how the system works. Capitalists are rewarded when their profits are high, and punished when they are not. It's nothing personal, it's just business. Unemployment is a choice, mostly made by employers. In many cases of unemployment, employers had the option not to fire employees. They could have kept all employed, but reduced their hours or days, or else rotated off work times among employees. Employers can choose to retain idle employees on payrolls and suffer losses they hope will be temporary. However, unemployment is received almost everywhere, and by almost all as a negative, unwanted experience. Workers want jobs. Employers want employees producing profitable output. Government wants the tax revenues that flow from employees and employers actively collaborating. So why has the capitalist system periodically produced economic downturns wherever it has settled across the last 2 centuries? They have happened, on average, every 47 years. The United States has had 3 crashes so far this century. .com in 2000, the subprime mortgage in 2008, and now coronavirus in 2020. Thus, the United States conforms to capitalism's norm. Capitalists do not want unemployment, but they regularly generate it. It is a basic contradiction of their system. There are good reasons why capitalism produces and reproduces unemployment over time. It draws benefits, as well as suffers losses. From doing so, reproducing a reserve army of the unemployed enables periodic upsurges in capitalist investment to draw more employees without driving up wages. Rising wages, and thus falling profits, would accompany investment surges if all workers were already fully employed before such surges. Unemployment also disciplines the working class. The unemployed, often desperate to get jobs, give employers the opportunity to replace existing employees with unemployed candidates willing to work for less. Unemployment thus operates as a downward pressure on wages and salaries, and thereby a boost for profits. In short, capitalism both wants and does not want unemployment. It expresses this tension by periodically adding to and drawing down a reserve army of the unemployed that it continually maintains. That reserve army exposes a stark reality that no ideological gloss ever fully erases. While unemployment serves capitalism, it does not serve society. That key difference is most glaringly in evidence when unemployment is very high, as it is today. Consider that today's many unemployed millions continue much of their consumption while ceasing much of their production. While they continue to take their means of consumption from socially produced wealth, they no longer produce, nor thereby add to social wealth as they did when they were employed. Unemployment thus entails wealth redistribution. Part of the wealth produced by those who are still employed must be redistributed away from them and to the unemployed. Taxes accomplish that redistribution publicly. Employees and employers, labor and capital struggle over whose taxes will fund the consumption of the unemployed. Such redistribution struggles can be, and often are, bitter and socially divisive. In the private sphere of households, portions of the incomes and wealth of the employed likewise get redistributed to enable consumption by the unemployed. Spouses share as do parents and children, relatives, friends, and neighbors. Working class always redistribute their incomes and wealth to cope with the unemployment capitalism so regularly imposes on them. Such redistributions typically cause or aggravate many tensions and conflicts within the working class. Many public and private redistribution struggles can be avoided. If, for example, public reemployment replaced private unemployment. If the state became the employer of the last resort, those fired by private employers could immediately be rehired by the state to do socially useful work. Governments would stop paying unemployment benefits and instead pay wages to the reemployed, obtain in return real goods and services, and distribute them to the public. In the 1930s New Deal did exactly that for millions fired by private employers. A similar alternative to private capitalist employment and unemployment, but not part of the New Deal, would be to organize the unemployed into worker co-ops, enterprises performing socially useful work on contract with the government. This last alternative is the best because it could develop a new worker co-op sector of the U.S. economy that would provide the U.S. public with direct experience in comparing the capitalist with the worker co-op sector in terms of worker conditions, product quality, and price, and civic responsibility. On that concrete, empirical basis, societies could offer people a real democratic choice as what to mix of capitalist and worker co-op sectors of the economy they prefer. U.S. capitalism's forced labor. President Trump and his government have sent out a notice to all 50 state governments and the United States offering them encouragement and guidance. Those are the words the notice used to order essential workers back to work after lockdowns from COVID-19. But much more than that, the notice also basically said that if any employer asks or orders his workers back to work and those workers refuse, not only would the employer be free to fire them, but the unemployment insurance they were receiving or might be eligible for could be and should be withheld from them. Now, you can dance up and down and left and right all you want, but you cannot dance around what this is. It has a name. It is called forced labor. It is forced labor to tell the American people that even though their employer may have done little or nothing to make the workplace safe, they must go to work if the employer chooses, and if they don't, they will be immediately reduced to poverty. They will lose their job. They will therefore lose their income, and they will be deprived of, or at least risk being deprived of, their unemployment insurance. Notice the government and whose side it's on here. Orders have gone out now repeatedly from the highest authorities in the country, ordering people back to work without any matching order for the employers to spend the money to make workplaces safe. The Trump administration and the Republican Party have announced that they are going to demand a law to protect companies that are telling their workers they must come back to work. The law would limit companies' liability from any lawsuits that workers and customers might pursue against the companies for having unsafe workplaces. The companies can thus save money by not making their workplaces safe. This is extraordinary. American working people are forced to go back to work, or there's going to be hell to pay. You can, of course, choose not to, and then you can suffer the job loss, the income loss, and possibly the lost unemployment insurance. What a choice for the capitalist system to give the majority of its people. So, an already bad situation is even worse now. If you go back to work and you get the virus, bring it home and infect the family and possibly thereby kill another person, you will not be able to recover anything from the employer who put you in that position. Remember, when President Trump ordered the meatpackers to go back to work, he did not order the meatpacking employers to make their workplaces safe. The Democrats haven't gone in that direction, which might make you a bit more sympathetic to them, but not necessarily. What the Democratic Party has been doing is pointing out that the 50 states are in terrible financial shape because unemployment means people don't pay taxes to the city or the state they live in. Citizen states need to do more for people when they're unemployed, but they get less revenue for it. It's the same kind of problem that, in effect, businesses have. but the Republican-dominated government, having bailed out businesses, is threatening not to bail out states and cities. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, even went so far as to urge cities and states to go bankrupt, not to pay off their obligations, which include the tens of millions of public employees who have been paying into their pensions their entire lives. So, here's what the Republicans have done. They've told the Democrats that they will not help cities and states unless the Democrats cave in and let them provide capitalist enterprises with limited liability protection in court against any suits from workers damaged by being forced back to work. All without the employer or the government having taken half of the steps that would be necessary to make the workplace safe. So capitalism, as a system, has always ripped off the working class. Most workers know it. They know it, if for no other reason, then the bar they pass on the way home always invites them in for a happy hour, because it knows that the hours at work weren't. But this takes it to a whole new level. You are going to be forced back to work. You're going to have to bear the risk of illness and death, and you're going to have to accept that. You can't go to court and recover for the horror that your employer has imposed on you. That is because the government has freed the employer from liability in court. If there was ever an economic system that no longer deserved the loyalty of the people living under it, we have now arrived at a capitalism that has brought us just to that point. On May 5th, garbage collectors in New Orleans, Louisiana, went on strike, demanding an increase in their wages from $10.25 an hour to $15 an hour. Also, they wanted their trucks used to collect garbage fixed because they were dangerously broken. And they wanted protective equipment, masks, gloves, all of that. As one striker put it, quote, "The garbage is full of items that carry the coronavirus. We are on the front lines of removing that from where it can infect other people, and we need to be protecting ourselves." What was the response of the officials in New Orleans, Louisiana, to this demand of frightened, underpaid, frontline essential workers who were earning the poverty wage of $10.25 an hour for hard, dangerous work? The city of New Orleans contracts with private services to take care of garbage collection. The private services, in turn, contract with temporary work agencies who provide the actual labor. The temporary agency, in this case, fired the striking workers. Did the garbage pile up with the workers fired? No, because the city of New Orleans, together with its contracting garbage collector, together with the temp agency that provided these workers, had a better plan. They brought over inmates from a prison in neighboring Livingston Parish who were required to do this work, and they were paid according to the state rules in Louisiana. The going rate for prison inmates is not $10.25 an hour, it is $1.33 per hour. A wonderful saving for the temp agency, for the contracting garbage collector, and for New Orleans. These three employers, two private, one state, got together to replace workers for whom they did not want to spend their money to keep them whole and to keep them safe. Instead, they got prisoners for whom they had to make no such expenditure. Are you horrified? I hope so. But this isn't more than the next step in the logical that drove President Trump to order the meatpackers back to work in the Midwest, even though they were showing up with an enormous percentage of workers carrying the coronavirus, forced labor. It is often said that capitalism, the system of employers and employees, depends voluntary agreements and contracts between employers and employees. Nothing is voluntary when you are forced by government order or by the order of the prison warden. And let's not forget, here in the United States, we put more people into prison per capita than any country. Capitalism with forced labor, that's what's growing in the United States. And it's a sure sign that the levels of tension, conflict, anger, bitterness, and division are deepening. The days, the weeks, and the months of a capitalism that work this way are numbered. We know that employers must literally be forced to protect the workers because that is the history of capitalism. That's how and why we have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration here in the United States, or known as OSHA. That's why we struggled for and passed the Food and Drug Administration's legislation and dozens of other laws governing the control of meat and bread making, and every other aspect of our society's food chain, as well as many other parts of the economy. We have forced labor now in the United States. Capitalism has become so desperate that it throws aside the polite veneer, revealing underneath what Jack London called the iron fist of capitalism. There's no more enticing you to work with a good wage or good working conditions. No, no, no. We have capitalist employers telling you, you either to come work here if we offer you a job, or we're going to reduce you to nothing economically. No job, no income, no unemployment insurance, forcing people back to work. And suppose the employer cuts the wage, or suppose the employer changes the workplace. No, there's no rule that governs any of this. It's the same naked iron fist. You work or you suffer, right away and seriously. There was a time not long ago when Americans looked at other countries where they found forced or slave labor and were highly critical. Maybe Americans will continue to do that. But now they risk a response. Who are you calling names? Look to your own practices. Making workers risk life-threatening infections they could take home to their families because employers have not chosen to spend the money to make workplaces safe and have not been forced by the government. It is a reduction of the last little bits of freedoms workers had. It's a sign of a capitalism that is not only in deep trouble, but is becoming increasingly desperate. Because the workers in the United States are beginning to understand what is happening also, and there will be repercussions. Next section. Cops, protest, class war, and capitalism. This is an interesting moment in American history. A turning point. If I can guess about the future, I believe it is a turning point because the injustices and inequalities that have accumulated over the last 40 years, and that go back much further into the test of American history, have now finally produced the uprising that was always coming, but took a long time to arrive. Capitalism has promised to bring great things to the human race. From its beginnings in the French Revolution, the people who wanted to end feudalism and bring in capitalism said it would bring liberty, equality, and fraternity. Americans, too, thought that revolting against British feudalism would bring similar change. As it says in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They wanted to create a democratic system in which everybody who's affected by a decision has the right to participate equally in making it. Capitalism promised a lot. However, on most of the really important things, liberty, equality, brotherhood, democracy, it didn't work out. The promises were broken. The goods were not delivered. We don't have equality. Not when Jeffrey Bezos has $160 billion, while Los Angeles County in California announced last week that 66,000 are living homeless on its streets, a 12% increase from the year before. We are one of the richest countries in the world. We have a rich, developed medical establishment. We hear this frequently. Yet, here's a disturbing fact for you to struggle with. The United States has a 5% of the world's population, but it has 25% of the world's deaths from the coronavirus. This is a system failure. We have incredible inequality in America today. 600 American billionaires together have more wealth than the bottom half of the population. A few people living in luxury while millions are denied enough money to feed their family, educate their children, or furnish their home. People get bitter about this. They get envious about this. They get all the feelings you can imagine and understand. So what happens if a tiny number of people have enormous wealth and power while vast numbers of people don't? What happens when vast numbers of people have so little wealth and power that they're really living paycheck to paycheck, always on the edge, always worried, always in difficulty? When you have a society divided in this way, you need to enforce the peace. A society broken, apart in two extremes of rich and poor, is a society riven with conflict. While the mass of people is worried about their poverty, the rich are worried about the fact that they're vulnerable because they are a minority. They're very small in number compared to the poor and the middle class, and they're afraid that the majority will somehow take away what they have. The rich also direct their wealth and efforts to convince the rest of society, even those who don't have much, to be worried about any systemic change, because perhaps even the little you do have will be taken from you too. So, we're full of tensions, suspicions, and trouble, into which we throw the police. Officers grow up in the same tension-ridden society, and when they join the police force, they discover that their job is to keep the lid on this exploding society. It's a tough world, and poor and middle-income people are being constantly ripped off. But the police are supposed to contain and repress people who say, I don't want to be ripped off anymore. I don't want to be treated like a human being. I want to be given a reasonable share of the wealth I hope to create, and when I work, cops thrown into that situation often don't act well. The police are still composed of individuals with individual choice. They didn't have to take that job, and if they took it, they didn't have to be mean, nasty, vicious, but of somewhat distress, not by way of excusing anything, but by way of understanding. The police are given a task no one can achieve. That's why their situation is absurd and dangerous. They go overboard and use excess force all the time. Police can't solve that problem. That's why throwing them at it is crucial for the population they abuse, and cruel for the monsters those police sooner or later become, as they do not withdraw either from the police force or from the social role that's assigned to the police. We are in the midst of a prolonged war, a class struggle, in which the employer class, a small minority, wages a war on the labor force, the 160 million Americans who produce the goods and services we all depend on. Those 160 million are under assault. They have been for the decades. Their real wages, which is the money they earn compared to the prices they have to pay, have not gone up in 35 years. They compensate for the loss of a rising income by having more members of the family go out to do more labor hours and by borrowing more money than any working class in the history of the world. By 2008, as we know, the combination of physical and mental exhaustion on the one hand and unsupportable, unsustainable debts on the other collapsed the capitalist economy. This economy had relied on exhausting workers and lending them the money that before had been paid to them as wages. It was impossible to keep up, and the system folded. Capitalism, as I say, survived as it usually has in the last 300 years. And figured out how to keep the system going without changing it, forcing people back to work, back into the very rules, the same inequality, and the same unsustainable debts that had led them into the crash. By 2020, when confronted with one of the viruses that periodically plagued the human race, and exhausted U.S. capitalism fell apart in a matter of 9 weeks. 40 million people were thrown out of work and forced to stay at home because of the virus. This put the American working class under unbearable pressure. Would the job even be there after you come off of unemployment? Who knows? Will you get sick? Who knows? How will you cope with life under these circumstances? Who knows? How am I ever going to pay my debts? Who knows? The working class has been subjected to something that's impossible to cope with. Additionally, for the 120 million who still have a job, competition threatens them. Employers compete with one another, trying to lower the cost of production so they can lower the prices and beat their competitor. How are they going to lower the cost of production now? They're going to cut your wage and benefits. They're going to ask you to come in a half an hour early, leave a half an hour later, and take a shorter lunch break. And if you say, I won't tolerate it, the employer will say, fine, go ahead and quit. I've got 40 million people getting more desperate each week to have some job, any job. They will take that job at the now reduced arrangements I offered you. If you thought that laboring working class in this country has been under pressure, that pressure is now being intensified. How do the capitalists hope to survive this catastrophic crash, the worst since the 1929 economic collapse? Coupled with their failed management of the virus, they use the same old methods. Divide the workers who are angry, make the white ones angry at the black ones, make the black ones angry at the white ones, make the population furious at the cops, and vice versa. Among these at the top, they're laughing all the way to the bank. In 2019 alone, U.S. police killed 1,004 people. Over the same year, police in England and Wales killed just 3. Australia, 9. 2 in Japan, and none in Denmark. You get the point. The U.S. divides people and kills large numbers to keep a system in place that cannot save us from a pandemic or an economic crash. Now the society is plunging into worse inequality than we already had. Will U.S. capitalism survive? Or will this be another time when white and black people understand that the system is the main problem, not each other? It will be hard. That's why it works so well to keep capitalism in place. But it's the system that's the key issue. We will not solve the poverty problem and the racial problems of this country without a fundamental change in how people get jobs, incomes, homes, automobiles, vacations, university educations. You name it. That's the social change that ought to come out of the courageous people reminding us that Black Lives Matter, that equality is something we can continue to fight for, and that we need it because the alternative is a society no one will want to live in. The system is over. It cannot support the society into which it was born, in which it grew and changed. Now it must pass away to make room for a system that works better for most people than this one has shown it can. Next, how racism is an essential tool for maintaining the capitalist order. U.S. capitalism survived because it found a solution to the basic problem of its instability, its business cycles. Since capitalism never could end cyclical downturns and their awful effects, its survival required making those effects somehow socially tolerable. Systemic racism survived in the post-Civil War United States partly because it helped to achieve that tolerability. Capitalism provided conditions for the reproduction of systemic racism, and vice versa. Every 47 years, on average, capitalism produces a downturn, a recession, depression, bust, crash, many words for a problem so regularly repeated. Political leaders, economists, and others have long searched for a cure for capitalism's instability. None was ever found. Capitalism has thus already recorded 3 crashes in this new century: spring of 2000, autumn of 2008, and now 2020. Defenders of capitalism prefer to call its inescapable instability the business cycle. That sounds less awful. Yes, it has cycles. Hard reality has always frightened capitalism defenders. They recognize that when large numbers of people suddenly lose their jobs, many businesses die, production shrinks, and governments lose tax revenues. The results can and do often threaten the entire economic system. Capitalism's cyclical crisis could potentially turn their victims against it and make them receptive to the systemic critics. This would be more likely to happen if in the society were roughly equally vulnerable to cyclical downturns. Most employees would then rightfully worry about their jobs, would be lost in the next crash. They would periodically face income losses, interrupted educations, lost homes, and so on. What relief employees felt if neighbors, rather than themselves, got fired. They would know that it might well be their turn in the next cycle. The losses, insecurities, and anxieties produced by such a capitalism would long ago have turned employees against it and provoked transition to a different system. U.S. capitalism slowed its instability problem by making cyclical downturns afflict chiefly a minority subpart of the whole working class, a position that minority to bear the brunt of each cycle and suffer its damages disproportionately. That minority was repeatedly drawn into and none thrown out of jobs as the cycle dictated. Any savings it might accumulate when working would be lost when unemployed. Repeated firings precluded such a minority from enjoying the benefits